Hello, everyone. We are going to be talking about the anatomy of a scholarly article. You will all be doing a review of an article for your presentation, as we've discussed. So first, I'm going to show you what the anatomy of a scholarly article are, so what each of the sections looks like. And then we'll do a quick PowerPoint presentation to talk about how to critically review an article and what kinds of questions you want to pay attention to in each of these sections. So let's get started. So any peer-reviewed journal article, now for your presentation, you could do a peer-reviewed journal article, such as I'm going to show you here on your screen for the anatomy of a scholarly article, or you can choose to do some other kind of non-peer-reviewed article. What's important is that in your article selection, that there be some data and that you have some sections of the proposal that report on data. So there should be a body and have some kind of data. Now that data can be quantitative data, or it can be qualitative data, and we've discussed the differences between that, but there should be some data in there because your job is to critique how they went about selecting the population, how they went about reviewing, presenting the case for the way that they approached the study, how they went about presenting the data, and were their conclusions rooted in good data as you see it. So I've pulled up in the anatomy of a scholarly article. If you look back to the video that was done by the library and posted in class session previously, they showed you where to find this in the library. An abstract is the beginning portion of a study, and that's a brief summary, usually under 250 words, that contains a description of the problem, the setting, an outline of the study or the experiment or argument, and then a summary of the conclusions and the findings. So many times when you're looking for studies, you're quickly looking at this abstract. Now, what's important for you to pay attention to not just an abstract of a study, but the entire study. Many people make a lot of assumptions based on what's written in an abstract, and while that is a true and accurate summary, if you don't read it in context for how it is that they define terms in their study, you could accidentally make some assertions just based on your quick reading of the abstract. So an abstract is meant to intrigue you, not to tell you about the whole study. That's why the whole study is there for you to read. In the introduction, that's the beginning part of any scholarly article, um, it will describe the topic and usually present previous data and do a literature review. Um, and this is usually its own section, and it really grounds the data it grounds the study in some context of some literature review. So it defines what it is that you're looking at, it defines the problem it is that you're looking at, and provides background information on a study. You will then see in a study lots of charts, graphs, and equations. Scholarly articles frequently include these and include statistical data related to the research. Sometimes you will find pictures or images, perhaps of a logic model, perhaps of a conceptual model, or if this is a qualitative study, you might see pictures of some kind of coding analysis scheme. So you usually will find charts, graphs, equations, or some presentation of data. Then you're going to find the body of the article. This could be, as few as a few pages, although it could be many more pages. And throughout that, you will usually see a method section and a results section. So after the literature review that sets up the problem, and usually will have a hypothesis or a research question, Remember, a hypothesis is for quantitative research. A research question is for qualitative research because you're not quite sure what the answer might be. You will then find a methods section that will outline how it is, or the approach by which the authors are going to investigate this problem or issue more. It will outline who the participants are and how they were selected. It will outline whether this was an experiment or what kind of study that it was. Um, Following the methods and the participation and selection of who the participants are, there's usually a results section, and that will tell you the findings. So you'll find some a discussion and some findings as well. Finally, most scholarly articles will then end with a conclusion. And the conclusion is where the author's going to summarize the results of the research. And as you'll see when we get to the PowerPoint, really want you in that section to key in on, did the researchers, was the conclusion grounded in the data that they actually provided in the study? You will also find references that were referred to in the literature review and throughout the article. We had a question in class on whether where you would find where something was funded. You will normally find that sometimes you'll find at the bottom of the reference section here, or you might find it here in the citation itself, the journal title, the number, and if it was funded, you would usually find that here. I'm going to stop sharing my screen here now that you have a overview of what a general scholarly article looks like. I'm going to reshare my screen, and I want to share a PowerPoint with you, and we will get that started. Okay, you should see that on your screen there, and I am going to, here we go. So now I want to talk to you a little bit about a critical review of a research report and what I mean by a critical review. So by critical review, I'm not suggesting that your job is to criticize exclusively in a negative manner. What critical means in this context is that it's the way in which you question the information and opinions that are in the text, and that you're questioning it in an appropriate way to attempt or evaluate whether it's good or it's bad, or what its worth is overall. So I'm really asking you to be critical thinkers and to ask critical questions as you're examining the article that you'll be presenting. So a critical review then is sometimes called a critique or a critical commentary or some kind of critical appraisal, but that's a detailed commentary on the evaluation of the text that's before you. The critical review may be a standalone exercise or be part of when you're creating a literature review. In the context of the presentation that you'll be doing, I want you to be doing a critical review of an article. And a scholarly article, as we just pointed out, they all sort of have the same anatomy, but they have different pieces inside of them or different content inside of them. If you find in a scholarly article, whether it's peer-reviewed or not, that has that basic anatomy of an introduction, methods, results, and conclusion, then you're selecting the kind of article I want you to use here. Now, you may also use a program evaluation report, as long as the program evaluation report has some of the same general characteristics of the anatomy. So if the peer review report has some background in terms of the problem that it is that it's looking at, and it also has some data, so maybe a chart or graph or presentation of the data, and then has a results and discussion section, then it would be appropriate to use for this particular presentation. If you have any question at all about whether or not the article you are selecting would be appropriate for the assignment, please reach out to me, share with me the link, and I'll take a look at it and I will let you know. So some of the things that before you actually pick up the report that you want to read that you can look at is, what does the title lead you to expect about the article? Sometimes titles can be misleading. What are the subheadings? How did the author organize the content? You should certainly read the abstract to get a sense of the author's arguments. Look at the references to see who it is that the authors are leaning on in which fields and disciplines. And you should look at whether the references are recent and relevant to the study. If you think there's more important work in the field that they haven't considered, then that would be an appropriate thing to mention. If possible, you might want to read a little bit about the author. So you might want to look up the author to get a sense of whether you think he or she is an authority to actually write on this subject, or to understand what lens they're bringing to their results and to their conclusion. If they work at a particular center, as we've talked about, if you work at the National Institute for Direct Instruction, then I'm going to know a little bit about what you think about direct instruction just because of the nature of the position that you have. So do you think that it's, is it someone who's known in the field? So some other points to consider, you want to read this article carefully, record your impressions. You could do and note the sections. You want to know who the audience is for. Why is the author writing this? If it's a program evaluation report, is it written for their administration? Is it written for people that are looking to make change? Or if it's a scholarly journal, is it something that they're writing to impact the field? Do you feel that the author is defining important terms? Does the author clearly outline the methodology that they plan to use? Did they outline how they went about doing the study? What are their central arguments or conclusions, and are they clearly stated or supported by evidence and analysis? And is the article lacking information that you expect to find? Is it easy to follow? What do you think of the author's style? Is it stilted or is it complicated? And is the language objective, or do you see it charged with emotion and bias? So these are some things to keep in mind as you're reading. So when you are critically reviewing a research article or a scholarly article, this is when you're really planning to go out and look at each section of the proposal. Your critique should be balanced, and where there are alternative suggestions, you must provide further emphasis to strengthen and eliminate the weaknesses of the study or the overall quality of the research project. So we're looking for you to outline where you think there's strengths, but also where you think there are areas for improvement that the author can make. So our job is to have sort of a balanced and critical review that looks at all aspects and looks at, are there different ways of looking at this issue or problem? Or if the author would have selected a different population or a more inclusive population, do you think the results would be different? I want you to speculate a little bit, and any questions that come to your mind as you're reading, or if you question the author's approach, to really write that down and to share it with the class. The purpose of a critical critique is to, again, outline the strengths and the weakness. You might want to provide suggestions regarding the methodological approach. So if this researcher in the scholarly article took a quantitative approach, and you think that the question at hand might have benefited from maybe a mixed methods approach, maybe some more data from the participants themselves in their own words to get into more depth, we want to hear about that. You want to be looking at whether you think the study's done a good job overall, or where you think you might have done things differently. And in the end, you want to make a decision of whether or not this article or this research report would have meaning in your role as a higher ed administrator. So I like to tell students to ask the so what question at the end of an article. So what is it? What is it that I can take away, and what is it that I can learn from this practice? If you can't learn a lot or take away a lot, you don't, it may have been a methodologically sound study, but if it doesn't add value to your work, you need to make these assessments of what it is you've pulled away from it and how it is that you can use it or others in higher education could use it. So please read and understand the research report that you select carefully. Carry out the appraisal of all the aspects of research. Try to avoid being generally vague. Be sensitive while framing your negative comments, and we want to be able to professionally identify where the challenges are, but also be practical and consider the limitations of the research. So if the research question is to look at a very narrow area in a very deep way, and they chose a qualitative approach with 15 to 20 interviews, and your only critique is that they should have done a survey, that a survey may not have been the way to go about doing it. Or if you said they really should interview 200 people rather than 20, that might not be practically possible. So I do want you to ask the questions of how you think it would look different if they were to change the subject population or increase the number of subjects. But I also want you to be practical in terms of the limitations of the research. Not all research studies are meant to do all things. So we have to respect them for what they have set out to do. I've made this point before, but I'll make it again. Be balanced. There's no report that's completely going to be strong, and there's none without something that could be better. So I'd like to hear a little bit about what you see as both the positive and the negative points as you go. This is more than a book report. This is you really asking these critical questions and highlighting strengths and weaknesses and doing more than what, because we will have all read the article, so we all know what it says. What we want to know is what you think about what it says and whether you think there was a better way of going about collecting the data, and some interesting questions if you were to pose if things had been conducted differently. So when you're critiquing the study background, you're going to want to look at the research problem or evaluation question that they presented and whether you think it's clear and concise and articulately stated, and whether it's appropriate, and whether they actually address this question in the study. Sometimes you might find that you might pick up a study that says that it's looking at students' mental health. And then when you look at the actual study itself, you see that they did one survey related to obsessive compulsive disorder. So the question is the whole study about mental health generally, or is the study about obsessive compulsive disorder specifically? And if it's about the more specific piece, if you only read the abstract and saw that things were correlated, mental health, let's say, with student performance, you would be missing, you would be taking the conclusions too far. So you're going to want to look at the background of the study. You're going to want to look at the objectives. So are the objectives of the study that are laid out, is it laid out in a logical manner? Did they identify variables? Did they define them? Are things, when they say that they're studying student achievement, for example, how is it that they actually studied student achievement, and could it actually be measured? So looking at the terms, the language that they select, and whether the way that they're actually studying that thing that they say that they're studying, whether those two things match. For studies with hypotheses, you're going to want to take a look at the hypothesis. Is it logical? Does it flow from the literature review that was stated above and previous in that introduction section? Are they expressed in a way that protect the relationship between two or more variables? Is it based on a conceptual framework that's used in the study? So you're going to want to take a look to make sure that the hypothesis is understandable and based in the introduction that was before it. So in terms of the research evaluation questions, because we could have either hypotheses or evaluation questions. Hypotheses are those in quantitative researchers that are stated as statements, relationships between variables, as we've discussed in class. Evaluation questions are questions where we may not predict the relationship between items, or it may just be asking about how a particular subject population reacts, feels, or is different. So when you're looking at research evaluation questions as opposed to hypotheses, the kinds of questions you want to ask are on your screen. Did they use the proper population, sample, or audience to ask that evaluation question or that research question? So if the question, research evaluation question at hand is about students, so these are things that happen when you're taping. Your dog stopped barking, but bear with me here. So, you know, if it's about student participation, then the method or approach of looking at student participation or student perception shouldn't be looking at what parents report students to perceive. It should always be a direct question. So you want to make sure that your questions are matched by the methods. And can the question actually be answered? Is it a feasible question? Conceptual framework, what I mean by that is the way in which the researcher sort of frames the issue or problem at hand and the relationship between the theory and the way that they tested something. In program evaluation, there may not be a whole lot of conceptual framework, but in many other studies, you're going to see sort of laid out how the concepts or the main constructs or the main ideas are connected to each other, what relationship these things have to each other. In the introduction section, there are many times a literature review. In some program evaluation reports, you're not going to have an extensive literature review, but if there is a literature review, I want you to ask whether or not you think that they've done a thorough job in doing it. Is it well organized? And is what presented there lead you to what it is and how it is that they're going to study something? Some of the more important parts of the critique is where I want you to spend a lot of time is in the critique of the methodological aspects. So what research design did they select? And do you feel it was an appropriate research design that matched their either research question or their hypothesis? I want you to also identify the design on whether it's appropriate to answer the question at hand. And how did the researcher go about controlling threats to internal and external validity? As outlined in your chapters, internal and external validity means the consistency in which we get the data, so the generalizability, reliability, and validity of the data. How did they try to control that? Was that with, if it was a situation where they gave a survey, for example, did they have someone else give that survey so that they would eliminate bias? Anything that you see, how did they go? Do you think that they did all that they could to control for internal and external validity? The sample and sampling technique is usually an area where students are quick and ripe to go ahead and make some critiques. So do you think that the sample that they picked to do the research on is representative of the bigger population if it's a quantitative study, or likely to give you the kind of responses that others in that group would give if you're doing a qualitative study. So did they use criteria for who it was that they were going to include or exclude in their sample? How did they go about doing that? And how do you think the way that they approach the sampling impacts the results that they received? The actual data collection methods and tools, so what instruments did they use to collect the data? Were they surveys? Were they interviews? What actual interaction did they do to get this? And do you think that the way that they went about collecting the data was reliable and valid? Were they adequate? Usually the authors will outline how they went about doing this, and I'd like to know your thoughts on that. Do you agree with the particular tools that they selected, or the way they went about asking the questions if they're shared in this study? Or what else would you like to know about their data collection methods and tools that they didn't report in the scholarly article? In terms of the results, conclusion, and other aspects of the study, when they show the data, is it clear? Does it make sense to you? Is the approach that they use to analyze the data appropriate for the question at hand? And is it clear and understandable to you, the results? If you have tables that are there in the study, are they clear and understandable? If it's qualitative data, did they select quotes from participants that actually match the themes that they talked about? What more did you want to see from the data? Did they give you enough examples of the data to support their assertions? And what, if any, approaches did they use to avoid bias or influencing the data that was obtained? In the anatomy of a scholarly article, I pointed out that there's a results section, and typically that's where the interpretation and the discussion of the data is done. And in that results section, I want to know if you think that what they said in the results section actually fit with the data that you read in the methodology section. Is it logical? Does it make sense, or what was there? Do you feel that the researcher discussed the findings? Did they, in relation to other research? Do you think that they took any liberties or jumped too far, and that the discussion and interpretation wasn't grounded in the data, or was already assumed before they received the data? I want you just to take a look at this and see if it makes sense to you, and raise any questions that you might have. Now, I don't expect you to be experts in the statistical analysis or in the way that people approach all of their studies, but I do think that you could provide a deep read and a fair critique of areas of question and concern that helps show that you can dig into an article to try to make sense of it and figure out which pieces. And there goes the dog again. Let's see if I can. Okay. Okay. Hold on just one moment. Hopefully you fast forwarded through that section now that the dogs are locked up. Thank you for your patience. Does the researcher discuss implications for practice? And so do they make sense of the data, and how does this impact what it is that you're looking at in the real world? And in the conclusions and recommendations, has the author concisely and precisely depicted the most significant findings? Do you feel that the conclusion is grounded in the data that was in the study? Do you feel that it's practical for higher ed administration? And are the recommendations, if there are recommendations, because sometimes in a program evaluation report, you'll have a recommendation section. Do you feel that those recommendations made actually fit in with the data that was above? So that is a quick overview of doing a critical review of a scholarly article. You'll want to take a look at each section. You'll want to take a look at the syllabus. I have 5 points outlined. You're going to be taking about 15 minutes or so to go through the article, raising questions about each of these sections, and letting us know where you think the author could have done a deeper dive, or if they had taken an alternate approach, how you think the data would look differently, to show that you can dig in, understand a scholarly article without being an expert in the stats, raise some good questions, and let us know, so what? So what does this mean, in terms of, for a higher ed administration, would you make a recommendation, or would you practice differently as a result of reading this article? So what does it mean? So thanks so much. Thanks for bearing with me with the dogs. Hopefully this will save you a bit of time in terms of our synchronous portion of class. So be seeing you soon.